It's kind of wild, right? Like how often you see teenage drinking in movies and shows, almost like it's just a rite of passage.
Right.
But they never really show what happens when it's not just a phase, when it becomes, well, something more.
Yeah.
And that's what we're diving into today, that blurry line between typical teen behavior and, potential addiction.
It's a tough one.
And we've got this guide here specifically for parents dealing with a child's alcoholism. And let me tell you, it gets real, real quick.
It does. It does. It's a heavy topic for sure. And it can be so isolating, because there's this stigma, this shame around addiction.
Totally.
But the reality is so many families go through this, and talking about it openly, honestly, that's key here.
100%. And that's where this guide starts, recognizing the signs. Because on the one hand, you've got teenagers being teenagers, pushing boundaries, maybe sneaking a beer from the back of the fridge.
Right.
But then there are those red flags, those signs that it's, well, more than just sowing wild oats,
Yeah, and that's the tricky part. Those early signs, they can be so subtle. I mean, think about it. Teenagers are supposed to be testing limits,
Like
right?
there's their job description, practically.
Exactly. So how do you tell the difference between what's a normal teenage angst and something more serious brewing?
And that's what I found so interesting about this guide. It doesn't just give you a generic checklist.
Mhm.
It digs into those easy to miss signs, those subtle shifts in behavior that might not even seem like red flags at first.
Yeah.
Like one that really stuck with me, this idea of drinking more than planned or for longer than intended.
Oh, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Because we often think about like the big parties, the blowouts, but this is about those quieter moments too.
Right.
Maybe they say, "Oh, I'm just having a beer with friends," but then they're, coming home hours later, and it's clear one beer wasn't.
Exactly. Or even those shifts in mood,
Yeah.
in their behavior after they've been drinking. Like maybe they were always a bit quiet, but now it's amplified after a night out, or they're more irritable, quicker to anger. It's like those little changes, it can creep up on you.
They do. They really do.
Yeah.
And they can be so gradual that it's easy to dismiss it as, oh, it's just a phase, or, that's just teenagers.
They'll grow out of it.
Exactly.
Mm.
But the key here, it's all about paying attention to those shifts, noticing if there's a pattern starting to emerge.
And it's not about like becoming a private investigator,
Right.
right? It's more like becoming a student of your own kid. Because another thing this guide talked about was this whole idea of neglecting things they used to love.
Yes.
Hobbies, sports, even their schoolwork starts to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just that they're blowing things off, it's that drinking is starting to take center stage.
Yeah, it becomes the priority, often at the expense of, well, everything else that used to matter. Now, it's important to remember, none of these signs alone are a diagnosis.
Right.
They're more like little warning bells,
Exactly, like little whispers saying, hey, pay attention here, something might be up.
That's a great way to put it.
And that feels like the perfect segue into the next big hurdle, actually talking to your child about it. Because it's one thing to recognize the signs, but actually sitting down and having that conversation.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That is a whole other beast.
It feels so daunting.
It can be really, really daunting, especially given, the emotional stakes. Parents might worry about pushing their kid away, saying the wrong thing,
Making it worse.
Exactly. And then there's this fear of sounding like a cheesy after-school special, like, we need to talk about your drinking.
Oh, I can hear the bad music now.
Right. It's like, how do you make these conversations real, genuine? How do you actually get through?
So true.
It's about striking that balance between expressing your concern, but also creating a safe space for them to open up. And that's something this guide really drives home. Support, not shame. It's not about lecturing. It's about approaching it from a place of love, understanding.
Because let's be real, who hasn't made a few questionable choices in their teenage years?
Exactly.
Right.
And that's an important thing for parents to remember. This isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up with empathy, even while you're setting firm boundaries.
So important. Which leads to the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
How do you actually do that? How do you start these conversations in a way that's, well, constructive, not a fight?
Right. Well, the guide has some really practical advice for that.
Yeah.
And the first thing it emphasizes is timing.
Oh, yeah.
You're not going to get anywhere trying to have this conversation when they're, under the influence.
Yeah.
Or if everyone's stressed and exhausted.
Recipe for disaster.
Exactly. Choose a time when you can both be present, engaged.
Yeah.
Maybe a quiet Sunday afternoon or a car ride. where there are fewer distractions.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's not about ambushing them either.
No, no springing on them out of nowhere.
Right. Give them a heads up, let them know you want to talk about something important. You don't have to give specifics, but just let them know you're there for them, that you're concerned and you want to talk.
And this is where I had a real aha moment with this guide. It talked about using I statements.
Well, yes.
So instead of saying, like, you're always coming home late and you're clearly drinking too much, which, let's be honest, no teenager wants to hear,
Yeah.
you might say.
I'm worried about your drinking and how it's affecting you.
Exactly. Such a subtle shift, but it changes the whole tone of the conversation.
It really does. Because those you statements, they instantly put people on the defensive, right?
Yeah.
But when you focus on your own feelings, your observations, it invites a more open, a more honest dialogue.
It's like, you're on the same team trying to figure this out together.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes so much sense. So we've got the timing down, we're using I statements. What else does this guide recommend for navigating these conversations?
Well, another big one is avoiding labels. So instead of saying you have a drinking problem, focus on the behavior you're actually seeing.
Give me an example.
Okay, let's say you've noticed they've been drinking more frequently and it's starting to affect their schoolwork. Instead of saying you're drinking too much, you could say, I've noticed you've been drinking more often lately, and I'm worried about how it's impacting your grades.
Right, because that feels less like an accusation and more like genuine concern.
Yes.
It's about the impact, not the label.
Exactly, and I think that's really important to emphasize. The goal here isn't to catch them doing something wrong or to force a confession.
Right.
It's about opening up that dialogue, showing them that you love them, that you're concerned, and that you're there to support them no matter what.
Which I imagine is tough for some parents to hear, right? Because we want to fix things, we want to control the situation, make it all better.
It's natural.
But with addiction, it's not that simple.
No, it's not. And that's why this guide really stresses the importance of patience. Recovery, it's a process, not an overnight fix. There will be good days and bad, steps forward, setbacks, the whole shebang.
And that's where the real work begins, right? Not just addressing the addiction, but navigating its impact on the entire family. And I think that's the perfect place to transition to the next part of our deep dive. Because this guide doesn't just stop at the individual, it takes a look at how addiction affects the whole family unit.
Absolutely. It acknowledges that addiction, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It affects relationships, dynamics, communication, the whole family ecosystem. And addressing those aspects, that's just as important as addressing the addiction itself.
It's interesting, when we think about addiction, we usually focus on the person struggling, right?
Right.
But this guide, it really made me see those ripple effects, the way addiction touches everyone in the family.
Oh, it's so true. And it's not just those everyday struggles like dealing with mood swings or covering for them when they, miss something important.
Right.
It's deeper than that. It's about how addiction can actually, reshape the whole family dynamic.
Like, what do you mean? Give me an example.
Well, the guy talks about how it can create this kind of unspoken hierarchy in the family.
Okay.
Where the person with the addiction becomes like the center of everything.
Oh.
And everyone else's needs, their feelings, they get pushed aside.
Wow, yeah. I never thought about it like that. It's like the whole family starts revolving around the addiction.
Exactly. And that's a recipe for resentment, burnout, just like a ton of unspoken tension.
Oh, for sure.
It's like everyone's walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing or make things worse.
Which, and maybe it's counterintuitive, but that can actually enable the addiction even more.
Precisely. Because when everyone's so focused on protecting the person who's struggling, it's easy to lose sight of their own needs, their own boundaries.
Yeah.
And that's a huge point this guide makes, setting healthy boundaries within the family.
Okay, so let's dig into that a bit. We touched on boundaries before, like when you're first talking to your child about it.
Right.
What does that look like on a bigger scale within the whole family dynamic?
Well, it starts by understanding that boundaries, they're not about punishment. It's not about being mean.
Yeah.
It's about self-preservation. It's about saying, hey, I love you. I want to support you, but I also need to take care of myself.
Which I can only imagine is so much easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
But, the guide emphasizes that setting boundaries, it's actually one of the most loving things you can do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it shows them that you believe they're capable of taking responsibility.
Yes.
Even if they don't see it themselves yet.
So it's less about trying to control them and more about empowering them to find their own way to recover.
Exactly. And that looks different for every family, of course. For some, it might be setting limits on financial support.
Okay.
For others, it might mean refusing to have those tough conversations when they're under the
Yeah,
influence.
that makes sense.
Right. Or even something as simple as saying, look, I'm not okay with you drinking in the house, and then sticking to that consistently.
That consistency piece feels key.
It's huge. It's
Yeah.
about those clear expectations and consequences, and this is the hard part, following through, even when it's really hard.
And I imagine that takes like superhuman strength sometimes when you're, dealing with the emotional roller coaster of addiction.
It does. It really does. And that's why this guide, it dedicates a whole section to self-care
Yeah. Yeah.
for the whole family, but especially for parents.
Because you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. You can't be there for someone else if you're running on fumes yourself.
Totally.
And that's where those basic self-care things come in, like getting enough sleep, eating healthy, moving your body a bit, even if it's just a walk around the block.
Right.
These things, they might seem small, but they make a world of difference in how you cope with stress.
It's not selfish to prioritize your own well-being, is it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
In fact, it's essential. And this guide, it really drives that point home. It's not about neglecting your loved one. It's about recognizing that you can't help them if you're running on empty yourself.
It's like putting on your own oxygen mask first.
Exactly.
So it's about finding that balance between being there for them and setting those healthy boundaries for yourself.
Yes, exactly. And sometimes that means seeking support for yourself too.
Okay.
The guide talks about those support groups like Al-Anon, where family members, loved ones of people with addiction, can connect with others who get it.
Because when you're in the thick of it, it can be so isolating.
Incredibly isolating. Like you're the only one going through this.
Yeah.
And those support systems, they provide this space to share your experiences, your emotions, get advice from people who've been there.
It's that reminder that you're not alone in this.
Absolutely. And speaking of asking for help, let's shift gears a bit and talk about those treatment options.
Okay.
Because we've established addiction, it's not just about willpower. It often needs professional help, professional support.
Right.
And this is another area where the guide really shines. It explains those different approaches in a way that's actually understandable.
Yes, because it can feel so overwhelming, all the jargon.
Totally. Yeah. But this guide, it breaks it down. And it starts by acknowledging that there's no magic solution, no one-size-fits-all.
Of course.
The right approach, it's going to depend on the person, how severe their addiction is, their whole situation, really.
So it's about finding that right fit, the thing that resonates with them.
Exactly. And the guide lays out those different levels of care from, outpatient programs to inpatient rehab and everything in between.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit, because I think a lot of people get those terms confused.
Sure.
What's the difference between, say, inpatient and outpatient?
So imagine inpatient rehab, like hitting the pause button on your life for a bit.
Okay.
You're living at the facility, totally immersed in recovery.
Got it. So that's the more intensive option.
Exactly. It's for people who need that structured environment, that 24/7 support. You're doing therapy sessions, individual and group, maybe medication if you need it.
Right.
And they help you build those life skills.
Like those coping mechanisms, ways to handle stress without turning to alcohol.
Exactly. It's about treating the whole person, not just the addiction. They give you those tools to build a life that supports recovery, even after you leave.
So it's like giving them the foundation to rebuild their life.
Exactly. Now, on the other hand, you've got outpatient programs.
Yeah.
This is less intense. You're still living at home, going about your day-to-day.
Where you're still getting therapy regularly. Right.
Right. So you have that support, that accountability, but you're not living there full time.
So it's more flexible, but I guess maybe not as immersive as inpatient?
Right. And there are different types of outpatient programs, too, depending on how much support someone needs.
Okay.
Some people might just need individual therapy once a week. Others might need more intensive group therapy, family therapy, or even day treatment programs where they're at the facility for a big chunk of the day.
So again, it comes back to finding that right level of care.
Exactly. It's about what that person needs to really recover. And the guide also mentions these partial hospitalization programs.
Oh, yeah, those. I was wondering about those. What are those exactly?
They're kind of like a bridge between inpatient and outpatient.
Okay.
You're at the facility for a good chunk of the day, getting intense treatment, but you go home at night.
Ah, I get it. So it's like more support than regular outpatient, but not as disruptive as inpatient.
You got it. And the guide, it also talks about aftercare planning, which is huge. because recovery doesn't just end when you walk out of treatment, right?
It's a lifelong journey.
Exactly. And having that continued support is so, so important.
So what does that actually look like? What kind of aftercare options are out there?
It could be anything from regular therapy sessions to joining a support group,
Okay.
like Alcoholics Anonymous, for example.
Yeah.
Which is a, peer-led support group, specifically for people recovering from alcohol addiction.
And what I liked is that the guide, it doesn't just mention these things briefly. It actually gets into the pros and cons, like with AA.
Oh, yeah.
It talks about how it can be a lifesaver for some people, but it's not necessarily the right fit for everyone.
Absolutely. And it encourages people to do their research, talk to their healthcare providers, and figure out what feels right for them.
Because at the end of the day, recovery is personal. It's not about following a script. It's about finding what works for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's about understanding that it's not linear.
Yeah.
There will be bumps in the road.
Setbacks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the important thing is to get back up and keep moving forward.
So we've covered a lot of ground, from recognizing the signs to having those tough conversations to the different treatment options. But I keep coming back to, like, what happens after treatment? Because as you said, it's not like you just walk out of rehab and everything's magically fixed.
You're so right.
Yeah.
And that's where, like we touched on earlier, aftercare comes in. And this guide, it hammers home that this isn't just checking a box. It's an ongoing thing.
Okay.
A lifestyle change, really. It's like you wouldn't run a marathon and just stop dead when you cross the finish line, would you?
No way. Cramps for days.
Exactly. You need to cool down, refuel, take care of yourself.
Yeah.
Aftercare, it's kind of like that cool down for recovery.
I like that analogy. Makes sense. So what's a good cool down look like after, addiction treatment? What does the guide suggest?
Well, it stresses that those plans, they're super individual.
Mm.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Makes sense.
But some common things pop up. Ongoing therapy, whether that's one-on-one or group, support groups, and figuring out those healthy coping mechanisms.
Okay, so let's break those down. Therapy, we've mentioned it, but how is it different in this aftercare stage?
So think of it this way. During that initial treatment, it's a lot of digging deep, right?
Right, getting to those root causes.
Exactly. Figuring out those coping skills. Aftercare therapy, you're still focused on that stuff, but it becomes more about, like, staying ahead of the game.
So it's less about crisis mode and more about holding on to those gains you made.
Exactly. Living a life that supports staying sober.
Got it, got it. Which makes those support groups even more important then, right? Because even with the best therapists, sometimes you just need that connection with people who get it.
100%. The guide, it actually has a whole section on the power of that peer support. And it specifically talks about 12-step programs like AA.
AA, yeah. We hear about it a lot. But for someone who's never been, can you, break it down? What actually goes on in those meetings?
Sure. So at its core, AA is all about shared experience, supporting each other, people from all walks of life at all different points in their recovery.
Okay.
They come together, share their stories, their struggles, their victories, the whole 9 yards.
So it's a place to be real, to talk about the stuff you might not feel comfortable talking about anywhere else.
Exactly. And it's not just talking either. A big part of that 12-step thing is finding a sponsor.
A sponsor?
Yeah. Someone further along in their recovery who can, offer guidance and support, be there for them.
Oh, so like a mentor, but specifically for this.
Exactly. Someone who's been there gets it.
Yeah.
And this guide, it makes a really good point. It says that while AA is great for some, it's not for everyone.
Right, right. One size doesn't fit all.
Exactly. There are other groups out there like Smart Recovery, that's more science-based, or Celebrate Recovery, that's faith-based. It's about finding the one where you feel comfortable, supported,
Where you feel seen.
Yes, exactly. And all those healthy coping mechanisms we talked about, those are huge for aftercare too, because life keeps on happening, right?
Tell me about it. It doesn't stop just because you're in recovery.
Nope. And that's where those skills are so key. They're like the tools in your recovery toolbox, the stuff you turn to when those cravings hit, when things get tough.
So instead of reaching for that drink, you've got other options.
Exactly. Could be going for a run, calling your sponsor, writing in a journal, whatever works for you. The key is having those healthy ways to deal with those emotions, those urges.
And I think that's such an important message because it shows that recovery isn't about being perfect.
Right.
It's about having those tools, those support systems to handle the tough stuff in a healthy way.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. And I gotta say, this guide we've been looking at, it really does a great job of making this whole topic, which can feel so complicated, much easier to understand.
Totally. And I hope everyone listening feels empowered to take what we've talked about today and, use it in their own lives, whether they're struggling themselves, supporting someone else, or just want to learn more.
100%. And if there's one thing I want people to take away from this, it's that you're not alone. There's help out there, there's hope, and recovery. It's possible.
So well said.
Yeah.
And on that note, until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep.